We're going to be talking about something this hour, which I hope will interest you. If it doesn't interest you, it means that you are guilty of what David Frum once accused George W. Bush of being guilty of, and that is being intellectually incurious, because this is a fascinating subject. We are talking about the papacy, ladies and gentlemen. Have you heard of the papacy? Yes, the papacy and popes. In fact, we're talking about World War II, Nazis, and the papacy. I'm going to be speaking with the author of a new book called Church of Spies, The Pope's Secret War Against Hitler. This is absolutely riveting stuff. The author is Mark Riebling, and what he contends in this book, with tons of research to back it up, is that the Pope, Pope Pius XII, actually behind the scenes did tons to work against Hitler, to save Jews. This is blockbuster stuff. So as you know, I wrote a book about Bonhoeffer, and I'm very, very interested in this, the role that people of faith played in trying to fight the evil of Nazism. So on the line with me right now is Mark Riebling. Mark, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Eric. It's an honor and a pleasure.
Oh, I'm so glad that we got you, because as you know, this period of history and this particular part of this period of history interests me hugely. We keep hearing, news about how the church did nothing, and the fact is, the church failed. And when I say the church, I mean the Catholic Church and the Lutheran Church. They failed, but to say they did nothing is to lie. Many people did nothing, but a few people, Bonhoeffer is one of them, and Pope Pius XII is another, did quite a bit. And so you've written a book about it. Tell us about what brought you to this subject.
Well, in a general way, I was raised Catholic, and one of the things I learned in Catholic school was that if I did or said anything heterodox, the nuns could really nail me because they had an awesome surveillance and espionage system. And so I later on read Yale historian Robin Winks. He wrote a book about scholars in the Secret War, and his assessment was that the Vatican ran the world's oldest and perhaps best intelligence system.
That alone is fascinating. I mean, because as an evangelical, I'm a very pro-Catholic, non-Catholic, but to me, the idea that the Vatican could do something like that, outside of the Catholic Church, we don't have that kind of thing. So explain that for a bit. The Vatican it's a tiny state. How can they have an intelligence system and spies? Tell us what you can about that.
Well, sure. There's a couple of pieces of that. The first one is that until Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, really under Constantine in the 4th century, the Catholic Church was essentially an underground organization. In other words, they had to meet at night in crypts.
You mean the Eastern Orthodox Church, right?
Well, I'm referring to, let's say...
Because the Catholics broke away from the Eastern Orthodox Church. You probably didn't know about the schism.
Sure.
Yeah, the Catholics are really Protestants. I know you didn't know about that, Mark, but we don't have time to get into that right now, and I might be joking, so please continue.
In any case, certainly if you read what the Church Fathers believed, I think they, in many cases, believed that Jesus was going to come back soon, and so it never really occurred to them they might become an official religion above ground. And so they really developed something which Eberhard Beske wrote about in his work on Bonhoeffer, which I know you know, where he talked about Bonhoeffer's engagement with something called the discipline of secrecy. Yeah. And really this is a Catholic doctrine which goes back to the Church Fathers, and it says that you can keep certain things secret even from believers. For example, the Our Father, and really the whole Bible was in a sense classified intelligence until Martin Luther came along. And so this is a very Catholic thing, and I think people outside Catholicism have a harder time getting their minds around this. Right. But certainly the Church is also a state. The Vatican is the world's, in fact, oldest institution and oldest government. It goes back to the 7th century. And so in the process of running this belt of papal states in the middle of Italy for more than 1,000 years, the Church did develop surveillance systems, and it had an army, and so along with that, it had an intelligence network.
So when Stalin asked how many divisions does the Pope have, it wasn't entirely rhetorical.
Well, Churchill's response to that was, the Pope's divisions are not of this world. And one of the interesting things is that Stalin is one of the first people to actually come out in public, surprisingly, and said, Pope Pius XII did plot against Hitler to remove him. Of course, Stalin's beef with this was that Pope Pius XII wanted a post-Hitler order, which was very anti-communist, and so this is how Stalin...
And that was kind of a sticking point for Stalin, was it?
A little bit, yeah.
A little sticking point. Now, let me just say, to underscore this for the folks who are listening, the larger subject here, I think, first of all, with me, it's always about what is true. And whenever the church or Christians are denigrated, and it's true, I have no problem with it, because the point is, I think that Christians, if they're honest, would be the first ones to want to say, that was wrong, we repent, let's get it right. But when people are really ideologically anti-church, anti-Catholic, anti-Christian, and they say these things that are not really true, it's wonderful when an historian like you or someone else gets it right, because it's a tremendous thing that people in World War II, Pius XII and his minions, risked their lives. Joseph Mueller, is somebody that figures in my Bonhoeffer book and figures in your book, the title of which is Church of Spies. I mean, these are tremendously heroic figures, and we owe it to them and to history to tell the truth, that there were people of faith who, because of their faith, did the right thing, and it's only fair to tell that story. So I just want to thank you for writing about this, because it's absolutely fascinating.
Well, you're welcome. And John Cornwell is a British journalist. He wrote a book called Hitler's Pope, alleging, Pius XII was guilty of complicity in the Shoah. And even he admits on page 234 of that book that the Pope tried to kill Hitler, but then he goes back to his thesis. And I think, what's wrong with this discourse is it's not so much incorrect as really besettingly incomplete. And you use the word curiosity. There's a striking lack of curiosity that, well, if the Pope actually conspired against Hitler, what does this mean? And so this is a fascinating story. It's really a spy story, a heroic Christian spy story. Joseph Mueller, who you mentioned, was really quite a fantastic
What a hero.
Character.
A hero.
He took Vatican secrets and flew them over the Alps in a single-seat sports plane from Munich to Murano, where they were then couriered down the mainland of Italy to the Vatican and stored in a hollowed-out red book on the top shelf of the Pope's library. And Mueller recruited a number of important people in Hitler's government as Vatican spies. One of them, as I talk about in Church of Spies, was the chief of Hitler's bodyguard, which is kind of helpful if you're trying to kill Hitler, to have the chief of Hitler's bodyguard as a source. Another one was a self-styled Nazi nun, Pia Bauer, who was the only woman wounded in Hitler's failed 1923 beer hall putsch, and she had a scar on her buttocks, and she liked to lift up her skirt to show off her scar there. She was
her proud Nazi scar.
Yeah, so there's a colorful cast of characters. There was one of these priests who was involved in trying to remove Hitler, had spent Good Friday in a saloon, and another one liked to do loop-de-loops in a plane over the student assembly. And, Pius XII himself had spent 4 decades in the Vatican Foreign Service, and including 12 as a papal agent in Germany. And he had then, through riding horses on the estate of mutual friends, come to know a lot of people in the German military who were part of the conspiracy against Hitler.
Absolutely. And I think it's important not just to be accurate, but to tell the story well. Mark Riebling has done that in this book. What was it really that made you decide to write a book about this? Because there's been a lot written on this, but I don't think there's been a book that really paints Pope Pius as the opposite of the book Hitler's Pope. Who wrote that? I'm sorry, I can't remember.
John Cornwell. Yeah.
I mean, there's this narrative in the culture that the church failed, the church turned a blind eye, the Catholic Church didn't care, and you're saying that's not true at all.
Well, it's really not true, and I think it was just a sense of justice and kind of outrage and curiosity on my part. I just wanted to know, well, what happened and what would possess the Pope to be involved in these secret operations? And, there just seemed something kind of cool about it. Pius XII is a compelling figure. He's really much a cipher, but he was quite a character. He had these quirks. He would carry a fly swatter on a scabbard inside his papal robe and, swat at houseflies in the middle of meetings.
Are you telling me Pope Francis does not do that?
Francis, I don't know about, but, Pius XII, he was also a very transitional figure. When he was born in 1876, General Custer was about to be ambushed at Little Bighorn, and he died in 1958. A rocket was about to orbit the moon. This is a pretty radical span, a change. Yeah. And so he was a transitional figure. He had 1 foot in the 20th century and 1 foot in the 12th century almost. And so through the fulcrum of these terrible events, the church kind of went from what it was to what it is. And, I just thought this was the idea that he was silent. In a certain sense, that's true, but so was Roosevelt and so was Churchill.
Well, okay, so your thesis is that From our point of view, he was quiet, but that was his intention. In other words, it was intention to throw the Nazis off while secretly he was working against them.
Well, in a certain sense, that's true. I mean, he did mention the Jews once during the war in October 1939, and then he didn't mention them until after the war. And one of the striking discoveries of my book, Church of Spies, is that the last day of the Second World War in which Pius publicly spoke the word Jew is also the first day that history can determine his complicity in plots to kill Hitler. And so what I argue is that this correlation was in fact a causation, that these two facts explain each other, and that it wasn't an accident that he went silent on that day. And we have the documents from the Roosevelt Library and from other original sources that say the German resistance asked Pius not to put them in a difficult position by doing too much. And you can imagine, Pope Francis, by analogy, if he says too much against ISIS, well, ISIS is they're just going to behead more Christians. And so it's one thing to say from the comfort of the present that the people in the past should have done X, Y, or Z. But really, in the context of the time, I think Pius was quite bold, although he did his boldest things in secret. And one of my findings is that, and I think this is true throughout history, is that leaders really, to a remarkable extent, follow the people that they are leading. And if they get too far estranged from the people they're supposed to be leading, people just will ignore them. And I think we saw this when the Catholic Church spoke against birth control, or when they denounced Napoleon at other times. They suffered a great loss of prestige. And the Pope, some of the tapes he made secretly, like Richard Nixon, they show the Pope discussing with the German cardinals in 1939 the fear that the Catholic Church will break away in Germany like they did under Henry VIII in England, because Hitler was just so popular at the time. And so Pius was a realist. He understood he held a weak hand, and he wanted to do what he could do, and if that meant acting in secret, then that's what he was going to do.
Well, it's funny that you talk about the Catholic Church within Germany breaking away, the fear of that, because there's a fear of that today. I don't know if you're up on that, but
Sure.
My Catholic friends say that the Catholic Church in Germany has gone kind of off the rails in terms of theological liberalism, and that Pope Francis really has to walk a tightrope in terms of keeping them in the fold.
I think that's true. Germany is a source of a lot of things. There's a lot of ideas, and obviously the Reformation came from Germany. And
yeah, I mean that's the funny part. It's like it's like that's where the Catholic Church, you in terms of losing the German Catholic Church. I mean, they sort of lost the universal Catholic Church to some large extent because of Luther. And I think for me, what's complicated is how politics. When the Catholic Church is involved, obviously we're talking about a kind of worldly power mixed with a spiritual power, which is what makes it so foreign to an evangelical like me and so fascinating in some ways, as your book details.
Well, that was one of the real problems that Pius XII faced and came to a head during the Second World War, is, how to be a spiritual institution in a political and highly physical world. And one of the things that came out of the Nuremberg trials was that Hitler's foreign minister von Ribbentrop had said that he and Hitler talked an awful lot about what the Second World War was doing to Christianity. And he said that Hitler often remarked that the forces of the Second World War were making the Christians revert to the church militant, or kind of war Christianity,
right,
as Hitler called it. And it's sort of like when you heat elements in a chemistry experiment in a test tube and you put them under incredible pressure, they revert to their basic elements. In a sense, that's what happened during the Second World War. A purer form of Christianity. If you could just imagine Bonhoeffer and Joseph Mueller, a Catholic, this Catholic and Protestant meeting in the Vatican crypt in July of 1942 at the excavation for the rumored tomb of St. Peter, and there each side is kind of saying, from the Protestant or from the Catholic side, well, maybe this schism was a mistake, and you find a kind of lifeboat ecumenism, right? When people are in straits, they come together.
I've never heard the term lifeboat ecumenism, but I've heard the term ecumenism of the trenches. I can't remember who said that. It may have been
that's a great term.
Father Richard John Newhouse. I can't remember who said it.
But interestingly enough, the phrase ecumenism doesn't exist in English before the Second World War. It comes out, according to OED, in 1948, and it's one of the conspirators who brings it into the English language. And I think this is another thing. When we saw Pope Francis come, and that wonderful, although tragic, but very poignant scene at Ground Zero where people of all different faiths were sitting around there, that's really a kind of transliteration of what began during the Second World War. And it was this kind of lifeboat ecumenism, as I would call it, where people of different Christian denominations had to come together against Hitler in Germany. And that's one of the good things that came out of these tragic events.
Well, that means a lot to me, this subject, because in writing my Bonhoeffer book, I also wrote a book on Wilberforce. And it's the same thing. You see it over and over. What I would call the true Christians rise to the occasion, and they don't pay attention to fussy denominational differences. They're talking about truth. They're talking about justice. They're dealing with good and evil. They don't have time for these theological niceties. They know that they're facing evil. And the idea that Müller was ecumenical enough to work with Bonhoeffer, Lutheran pastor, the fact that the Lutheran pastor Bonhoeffer was ecumenical enough to work with Müller, they understood that they needed to link arms to fight evil. And I do think that you see that through the centuries. In the story of Wilberforce, of course, it was the same kind of thing. That had many in the Church of England who were turning a blind eye to slavery. But the people who were serious about their faith did not. So it sounds to me like that's what the story you're telling as well.
Oh, that's very much the story, and there's so many different manifestations of it. One of them, which I discussed in Church of Spies, which you perhaps have heard of, is the White Rose student movement. Oh,
absolutely.
Right? In Munich, these poor kids were beheaded for distributing leaflets calling out Hitler for his atrocities. And the White Rose was great because it had, a couple Catholics, a couple Protestants, it even had a Buddhist. It had people from all different kind of stripes and worldviews, but they were coming together, united against Hitler. And in a way, if you look at the postmodern sensibility, the only thing that really unites us today is that everyone agrees, that Hitler was bad, and he's kind of become the reverse standard of value here, at least. Right. And the people who don't really agree on that, would be maybe some of the people in a certain part of the world that are very intolerant. And so, it is true that you have to have sometimes extreme situations to bring out what you have in common. But this is really, Pius XII was remarkably tolerant. People when people think about things like the Holy Office of the Inquisition, they think about they imagine people being tortured and having to confess and, this kind of thing. But the Holy Inquisition also did things like denouncing anti-Semitism. It's hard to get your mind around that. And Pius XII was very supportive of people in Germany, for instance, who wanted maybe to convert, married pastors who wanted to convert to Catholicism. He let them stay married and still say Mass.
Hold on one second there, Mark. We're going to go into a hard break here. Folks, I'm talking to Mark Riebling. The book is The Church of Spies, The Pope's Secret War Against Hitler. We are talking about the Pope, not Pope Francis. No. Pope Pius the 12th, not to be confused with the 11 other Pope Piuses, 1 through 11. Pope and Mark Riebling has written this book, Church of Spies, The Pope's Secret War Against Hitler, to set the record straight. Mark, once again, thanks for being with us on this program.
I'm really happy to be here. Thanks, Eric.
In Chapter 25 in your book, you talk about this. I just love this is the hugger-muggery of Catholicism in the Vatican. You talk about a spade pushing through a vault in the Vatican crypt. And you say the Pope's excavators discovered a grave, and they believed that it was the grave of St. Peter.
That's right.
Tell us about that.
Well, it was a secret project during the darkest years, the bloodiest years in history. The Pope was secretly digging beneath high altar of St. Peter's to try and see whether these rumors dating back to the Renaissance were actually true, that St. Peter's bones lay beneath the Vatican. And part of his reason was he wanted to try to make Protestants understand more why the Bishop of Rome might be important. And this had been a sort of dispute between Catholics and Protestants. And so the keeper of the Vatican crypt, who was also one of Pius XII's spy masters, a guy named Monsignor Ludwig Koss, he would go down there every night, look at the excavations and see what they were going to find. And so sort of almost it was like a subplot. They were digging down and through this secret war against Hitler, they were at the same time digging down to the foundations of the church, both metaphorically and physically. And they did find a grave down there, and although they took maybe 25 years to study it, they concluded in 1968, Pope Paul announced that, yes, as far as we can determine, these were the bones of Peter. What's interesting to me is that it was at the site of this grave that the Pope Pope's Jesuit German advisors convened people like Bonhoeffer and others, and they talked about how to bridge interfaith differences. And people like Bonhoeffer and Bonhoeffer's brother-in-law, Hans von Dohnanyi, just found it very inspiring to be down there and to sort of go down these stairs and go back 20 centuries and be in a lost world. I mean, the Vatican itself existed above this lost city of the dead, a necropolis, as it were. And one of the interesting things is that the evidence shows archaeologically that the Christians at the time had an identity which was very comfortable using pagan motifs, using Jewish motifs. It was really kind of a gorgeous mosaic of all kinds of different images, and it didn't become so set as it was later. The early Christians were very comfortable showing Christ as the sun god Helios, for instance.
Right.
So it's actually kind of diverse and a fascinating subplot.
Well, that's one of the things I love about Bonhoeffer is that he was comfortable with the classical world, and I think that's one of the things that particularly evangelical Protestants, of which I guess I'm one, have lost, is the richness of the faith and the ability, or I should say it's not just the ability, but it's the lack of fear of the classical world. Whereas today, in some ways, we've lost that. So it's interesting that you talk about that in the book as well. I did not know that Bonhoeffer went down into this crypt. There are many things that I wasn't able to write about in my book, so this is absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, Bonhoeffer, one of the things he said down there was, he said, well, maybe in some cases the Protestants in Germany had really taken an economic interest in seizing monasteries and church lands, and that was kind of a bold concession on his part. And in return, one of the Jesuit German priests said, well, the Italians with their cult of the Madonna and the Italian novels of mother love, maybe they overemphasize Mary, And so it was this interesting kind of self-criticism that you see down there it kind of called forth an honesty, a self-reflection, a self-criticism. And I think all this became very important after the war, when again Christians in Europe were facing a common enemy in communism, in Stalinism. And the same cast of characters, those who survived, Joseph Mueller and others, really became quiet builders of the post-war order.
Right.
Allen Dulles of the CIA, the OSS at the time, he backed all these guys. He called them the crown jewels, and they became linchpins of the post-war order. And Joseph Mueller himself, I don't know if you know this, he was the godfather of the euro. And that these talks of a united Europe also came out of the crypt, this idea, what comes after? Is it going to be a whirlpool? Is it going to be communism? And so the Vatican, being a transnational institution and always having been a transnational institution, saw that the idea of a united Europe could be good, an economic order, a single currency, all these kinds of things.
That's fascinating. I think that the idea of a united Europe is terrible, but that's another subject. So I guess this proves that my hero, Ochsensepp, Joseph Müller, was not perfect. That's healthy. It's healthy for me to see him as a man with feet of clay, because he was so great. We're talking about the Pope. We're talking about history. We're talking with Mark Riebling about his new book, Church of Spies, The Pope's Secret War Against Hitler. And Mark, I just have to ask you, in your research, what fascinated me, I sort of knew this before I did my book on Bonhoeffer, but to find the facts, to realize that Hitler and the top Nazis were bitterly anti-Christian. Somehow, people seem to think that, if you weren't a Jew or if you hated Jews, you were a Christian. On the contrary, the most serious Christians were doing all they could, giving their lives to save the Jews, at least as far as I can tell. There's so many stories, Maximilian Kolbe and Corrie ten Boom, and on and on and on. And yet the narrative persists. But the fact is that the Nazis despised serious Christians, as far as I can see.
They really did. And in fact, when Hitler invaded Rome in September 1943, at that point it was really touch and go whether or not he would launch an SS operation to invade the Vatican with paratroopers, kidnap the Pope, bring him back to Germany, where Himmler, the chief of the SS, had launched plans to have Pius XII executed publicly to celebrate the opening of a new soccer stadium in Berlin. And so we know.
Are you kidding? I have never heard that.
No, that's absolutely true.
But that sounds insane. It's one thing to want to kill the Pope or kidnap him. That's crazy and double crazy. But then to execute him publicly to celebrate the opening of a soccer stadium, what was the logic behind that?
Well, they saw themselves as like Nero. These are going to be festival games. These were barbarians. And they said, yes, we're barbarians. They totally rejected And in fact, I don't mean to say this in a provocative way, but Hitler at one point said in his table talk, "Why did we have to have Christianity? It's so meek and flabby. We should have had Islam. I wish the Muslims had conquered Europe."
Yeah.
And that was
I quote that in my book. Oh, I'm quite familiar with that. I quoted it in my book, I think as an epigram for one of the chapter headings, because I said, this is so fascinating. Hitler was looking for a different kind of religion, and that's why he preferred the religion, the pagan religion of the Teutonic prehistory.
That's right.
And that's why he loved Wagner, because he was in love with that kind, the religion of the earth and the soil, the religion that is hard, that does not value mercy.
That's right.
And love and all of those weak Jewish virtues.
Right,
I mean, it's amazing.
Yeah. No, he thought as this virus somehow that at a biological level that had to be rooted out. And these were people who were insane, but sadly an amount of this did come out of liberal Protestant thinking, which was compatible with racism, and even the Catholic Church felt intimidated to stand against the scientific racist view, which people forget at the time, because the Church had been on the wrong side of Galileo. It didn't want to get caught on the wrong side of racism, and so it resisted.
Right.
But the people at the time, intellectuals, look at people like Heidegger. How did they speak out? So this is a very messy picture, but certain things become simple. One of the things is that there's no atheists in foxholes. Well, there's no real Protestants either. In a certain sense, people want things to be, they don't want to have to reinvent the wheel in every kind of crisis situation. That's one of the virtues of Catholicism, wartime Catholicism, is that it gives a system of iconography, as you would say, and it really kind of gives clear choices. And because it's so well codified over the centuries, the individual isn't thrown back on his own reading of Scripture all the time. And that could be helpful in certain situations.
Well, without a doubt. I mean, I would think that the most intellectually honest evangelicals would say that you can never have sola scriptura. In other words, that the Church for 2,000 years has been reading the Scriptures, and that you go back to the Church Fathers, and before the Church Fathers to the Apostles, and the way they read the Scripture. So I guess they would say Scripture reads itself on some level. But you're right; it's very complicated. Now, I'm curious. Why do you think that narrative is out there? That there's so many people that they're hostile. They're hostile to religion, and they seem to be. Look, I just saw an article in the New York Times this morning. I guess it was a column by Frank Bruni talking about the Catholic Church, and it was so cavalierly ideological.
Yeah.
It didn't even seem to.
Right.
It's just sort of condemning the church and Christians, and they're getting a free pass in America because of religious liberty. Very intellectually sloppy, but it seems to be out there. And I noticed on the back of your book you have a blurb by Sam Harris, who's a very outspoken atheist, but he seemed to look favorably on your book. What are your views on that?
Well, there are two sort of points at which this geyser of anti-Catholicism from which it issues. The real point is the French Revolution and liberalism, you have to see it as a reaction against Catholicism as such. It really is, because it's the old order. And so if you want to have economic competition, you got to break the guilds, and you have to break the old, let the Jews out of the ghetto, and all this kind of stuff. So liberalism itself, in a certain way, simply is, archaeologically or in a natural history sense, is a reaction against the power of the church. The second thing is that...
But I would say the worldly power of the church.
For sure.
That's kind of the problem.
Yeah, and I think there's a very clever phrase here used by the philosopher Leo Strauss. He called it a liberal persecution of authoritarianism. And if you think about it, that's really kind of shrewd, because especially beginning in the 1960s, I would even say that the 1960s began intellectually not with the free speech movement at Berkeley, but with a play by Rolf Hochhuth in 1963 called The Deputy, which is what began this whole narrative that Pius was silent on the Shoah. And what it was really saying there is that the Pope, whose name means Papa or Father, he's a symbol of established authority. And basically the established authority is a fraud, he's a fake, he's a Nazi, and so on and so forth. This then becomes a standard motif for the generation of the 60s to attack its parents. And once you tear down that symbol of authority, it opens the way for all the changes which happened in the 60s, many of which I think were good. You and I were born in the same year, 63, so we saw a lot of these things happen as we were kids. But really, this is part of the narrative of the 60s and of the attack on authority. And, what happens is that sometimes the baby gets thrown out with the bathwater. And I think it fits their worldview to think of the Pope being a Nazi.
What's the name of the play that you just said?
The Deputy.
I did not know that. This is fascinating.
His Pius XII's reputation was ruined by a work of fiction. But, as from Uncle Tom's Cabin or Frank Norris, The Octopus, a lot of times fiction molds our views.
I have no question. But it is interesting, the larger narrative, and you just put your finger on it, that in 1963, the year of our common birth, Rolf Hochhuth, how do you say it? Hochhuth wrote this book, this play called The Deputy, and it really is the narrative. I would argue, in fact, since 1963, I would say the 60s officially started in 1963, the metaphorical 60s started in 63, and the whole idea was the overturning of the old order, and that the Pope obviously means Papa the Father, whether it was Nixon, whoever represents authority, this idea of question authority, that all of the heroes, it's kind of like, the 12 gods of the Greek pantheon taking over from the Titans, the war.
Right.
It's something happened, and so the narrative since then has been authority is bad, the church is bad, God is bad. It's very interesting. Men, all husbands are abusive. It's an interesting narrative, and it's taken over. And so that's why I get so excited when a book like yours comes out, because history is history. Your book is The Church of Spies, The Pope's Secret War Against Hitler, and you have chapter and verse, no pun intended, on how, in fact, Pope Pius XII was not Hitler's pope, quite the contrary.
Yeah, it's really a corrective. I'd like to think it's a great spy story as well as a kind of, I wouldn't say revisionist, but it certainly completes the narrative. You can't just say Christians were Nazis, Christians were complicit. Some were, some weren't. It was a difficult thing, but we need heroes. And Pius XII, in his own secret way, was a hero. So was Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So was Joseph Mueller. So were some of these Jesuits who stole the blueprints to Hitler's bunker and provided them to Hitler's would-be assassins. Many of these guys were hanged. Some of them escaped across rooftops, but the ones who survived did leave records, and I think it behooves us, we who have inherited this liberal order, which was saved through the heroic efforts of people from FDR to Bonhoeffer who didn't make it. We owe it to ourselves to look at things, and even when they're tough to look at, I think it's important. We all benefit from knowing, as you say, just what's true.
And I have to ask you, what was your source when you talk about Bonhoeffer down in the Vatican crypt and that? Because I did not come across that, so I'm absolutely fascinating. I thought I'd read everything there was to read.
Joseph Mueller had done a number of interviews with post-war intelligence debriefers from the CIA, and I was able to get a hold of these, which were released by the Army War College in 2011, and they were in German, and I had to translate them from German. But that's the main source that I used there, was Joseph Mueller himself recalling this, and also the testimony of Father Ivo Zeiger, who was a German Jesuit in Rome. He corroborated this. So
I mean, and did he corroborate how Bonhoeffer was hanged?
How Bonhoeffer was hanged, that's an interesting question. I have to go back to my notes on that. Mueller wasn't there, but he was able to learn it because he was a post-war minister of justice in Bavaria, and so he had to prosecute these guys who had Bonhoeffer hanged.
Right.
And so that was the source of that.
Wow. Well, gosh, this is just so fascinating. I'm so glad we're able to have you on. Mark Riebling is the author, R-I-E-B-L-I-N-G. Mark Riebling. The book is Church of Spies, The Pope's Secret War Against Hitler. Absolutely fascinating. Comes with it's festooned with happy blurbs from all kinds of people, from George Weigel to Sam Harris. Pick up a copy. It's the Eric Metaxas Show, MetaxasTalk.com. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, Eric.